Welcome to my studio. Today I'm doing a quick tutorial on this little floral scene. I love going to greenhouses and taking pictures. I'm always really inspired by plants. I certainly have my own. They always seem to look better in a greenhouse, at least for me. So I'm really excited to show you guys my process, the steps I take, and hopefully it gives you more information, gets you excited about the course. I know I'm excited. And yeah, I hope this is enjoyable and fun, and thanks for being here. So before I jump in, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my setup. I always work off of a pre-primed canvas. The more traditional way of doing this is taking something like a raw canvas and doing a sienna or like a light warm brown wash over it. The reason for this is because when you work off of stark white, it's really hard to get a handle on your values. I find that this is incredibly important when you're a student and you're still really learning how to sort of get your sea legs or like figure out how to orient yourself within a painting. I still do this. I like doing this with bright colors because I am a bright, vivid painter. So I have a big stack of these in my studio already primed and ready to go. I really like orange, and so I'm just gonna jump in. I'm gonna start with the drawing step, and this isn't drawing like drawing proper, so it's not a big thing of paper and graphite. This is really just with a paintbrush, giving myself some indicators of where the form lies, where the big ideas are on my painting. And then that way, when I go in with the first layer, I have a little bit of a map of where I'm going. I talk about how to draw in the course, so I go through that in more detail. But for now, I'm gonna just utilize a little bit of my experience and just kind of dive right in. But I'm also gonna choose a complementary color. It's a color that's not found in my reference photo. But most of the drawing, as most of the underpainting, is going to get covered up anyways. The drawing is really just about giving myself guideposts. So when I go in and do my first layer of painting, I have information to work on. It's less about rendering a good drawing. You're not gonna show this to anyone. It's not the finished product, but it'll help you with the rest of your painting. And that's kind of the underpinning of all of my process and how I teach painting and how I approach painting in my own personal practice. It's less about perfection. It's less about hurrying and getting to a resolve quickly. And it's more about setting yourself up to make mistakes and be able to work through it and not have it be devastating. So I'm using acrylics. I love acrylics as a teacher because they dry very quickly. And if you mess up, you can just go in on top of it 10 minutes later. Go get a coffee, go get a tea or water, and then come back and try again. And that's actually kind of how my style is, how I teach and approach painting is you get closer and more refined as you go, but mistakes are built in, and we love mistakes around here. They happen, so why not just find a method that works with them? And hopefully that's what you guys will learn about today. So this is a nice cadmium orange. I just used some leftover paint I had in my studio, thus the imperfections. Never want to waste paint. And I'm gonna go in with a phthalo blue green shade. Blue and orange are lovely complements. This is really vivid. If you don't like to work this vivid, that's totally fine. You can do a burnt sienna in like an alizarin crimson or a brown and just etch in your draw line that way. I love colors, so I'm just gonna go in bright. For my medium, I'm just using a little bit of water, not too much. I like to dampen my brush and then just go in with my paint. I'm using Liquitex and Golden Heavy Body acrylic paints. I really like the viscosity. It kind of has an oil-like finish at the end, so I really like them. But you can use any paints. I do recommend, for the sake of opacity and layering, that the higher end paints are gonna work better. It's almost like a different medium. I find that you can really cut corners and budget around most other parts of painting, but the pigments really matter. So first I'm gonna find my middles. I'm just eyeballing it. If I was really unfamiliar with the subject matter of painting really large, or back when I was newer, I would grid out what I'm painting a little bit. And I actually show the step-by-step on how to do that in the course. Two things. One, I am familiar enough with drawing that I don't feel like I need it too much, especially at this scale. But also this is an organic shape. It's plants. So if you're a little bit off, if you're not 100% accurate, it's not too devastating. Now, if I was painting architectural landscape or a portrait, being off by a millimeter can really make or break your painting, if you're aiming for realism, of course. Here, it's not as important, so I'm just gonna jump right in. And if I mess up, remember, we can just layer later, and it's not too big of a deal. So I do sort of work from the perimeters. It's kind of like a puzzle. Working from the outside in seems to be helpful. If I start from the inside, usually by the time I get to the edges, my proportions are off, even as confident as I am in my drawing skills, that tends to happen. And again, we're not really drawing, we're not rendering, we're mostly just creating edges and outlines for ourselves so that when we go in with the paint, we sort of can keep things relatively contained. I always think of this as sort of a fact-finding mission. You're becoming familiar with your reference photo, or if you're painting from life. In the course, I teach how to work from either. You're just building up familiarity with your subject matter. So the drawing doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, if I get this all completely wrong, which, happens, I will go in with a different color just right on top. In this case, I would choose maybe a bright yellow because it's going to contrast. It's not going to be confusing with my old redraw lines. And I'll just try again, right? Again, we're going to cover it all up. It's not a big deal. Pressure's off. We're enjoying the process. But even if I got all of this wrong, it wouldn't be a waste because I'm learning about the painting, and that is incredibly valuable. Another thing that's helpful is dropping verticals in your composition. And when you do that, you're sort of just checking where everything lines up. In my mind, the edge of this lined up with this bar back here. Of course, I drop a vertical, I check, and it does not. So it's good information to have. Take note at what the focal point is. You don't have to have this all completely mapped out and perfect. You're going to learn as you paint what the focal point is. And then you'll probably lose it at some point and then you'll get it back. That's just the nature of painting. But for me, it's a very clearly this specific flower is holding my attention the most. But I always just sort of mentally take note, what is exciting about this photo or this object that I'm painting in real life. And I'm gonna make sure not to over render the leaves. It's very tempting to want to paint in the veins and all the little subtleties, and often it's usually what makes the painting exciting. But remember, this isn't a drawing for drawing's sake. This is a drawing to help guide you as you create a painting. So it's less of a contour drawing and more of a map. Another thing you'll want to do is just before you start painting is make sure that your canvas is the same ratio as your photo. I just take pictures on my iPhone. In the photo editing, there's usually a cropping tool and it gives you ratios at the bottom. Just make sure it lines up. I have fudged this before where I will think something is really close and then I start painting it and everything looks really stretched. But especially if you're doing something that requires a little more accuracy, again, a portrait, double check your ratio. Another thing that can really help you in your drawing is sort of keeping an eye on the negative space. In a composition, you have positive space, negative space. Positive space is the object, right? It's the figure, the flower, the leaf, anything that sort of stands out in the forefront or is really high up on a visual hierarchy, i.e. it's the most important thing you're looking at. Here for this flower, I was trying to figure out how to draw it in, and then I looked at the negative space between this flower and this flower, and just changing my perspective while drawing just gave me enough information that it helped me draw in that form accurately. So just another trick to keep an eye on while you're painting and a way to help yourself. And of course, you can always measure this out, grid it out, use a projector. There's no bad way to make a painting. I always think it's important to invest in your skills and learn to draw, but to be able to draw doesn't mean you're an artist. That's a very fifth grade way of thinking, in my opinion. Think about all the amazing art we would miss out on if we made that a threshold for being an artist. And so finding these forms back here are just not too important for me. Again, we're just marking in general shapes. How do I know if I'm done and when I'm done with the drawing phase? This is a matter of personal taste. My first layer is very, as you'll see, pretty just messy. And so painting in too much detail really doesn't help me. I'm gonna paint over most of this. I would never hang this up by itself. It's not a beautiful contour drawing, but it's a roadmap. It's gonna help me with my next step. And for that, I'm grateful. The next step is, of course, we're gonna jump in with paints. We have a better, deeper, more thorough understanding of our image. At this point, we have guide rails to kind of keep us contained. There's a couple things to keep in mind. First, we are just getting an approximate here. This first pass is low stakes, okay? We are just getting close enough that with our next round of color, we will be able to make better decisions. So my first few colors I place in here, they just need to be in the ballpark, right? Because ultimately, I'm just covering up this bright orange and the bright blue so that I can, in the future, make better color decisions. It's really hard to know what you're doing as far as saturation and value when you have these bright colors next to it. And even if you had something more muted, like a sienna and a alizarin crimson draw line, it still would be relatively tough to nail that. So I'm gonna go in a little bit muted and close enough to some of these colors, and then we're gonna work up from there. With acrylics, unlike oil, because it's opaque, because it dries quickly, and because we're really leaning into the layering, you want to work from low intensity up to high intensity. A big criticism of acrylic paint is that it can look really flat and really overly saturated, doesn't have a lot of depth. And the way to combat that is by working up slowly. So with oil paint, you sort of do the opposite, right? Because it's so easy to create mud, because blending happens so easily, because the drying time is much, much longer. You start with more true vibrancy and then you blend backwards. We're working the other way. I also like this because with the first pass, you can build up to your saturation. I love using lots of really high contrast and bright colors, but if you go in with that right out of the gate, you're going to create a very flat image. And so you sort of have to sneak up on those bright colors. And again, working low saturation, building your way up is a very helpful way of approaching your color. I also start out usually with a pretty large brush. I think I'm going to use a size 12, so I would even sometimes go larger. This is fine for now. Always want to go a little bit bigger than you think and that you're comfortable with. If you're a new painter, I always find new painters, they sort of make up for their lack of confidence by choosing tiny brushes. And that is very hard to do because this brush says accuracy, it says detail. As a new painter, you're going to stay away from that until you have so much information, so much already rendered, that when you go in with this, you're just finishing. You're just adding the last little bits of detail. You want to do most of your painting with a large brush. That way you're just getting general shapes, general forms. And then as you build detail and as you resolve, you work down smaller and smaller until your last couple passes are with a tiny brush. If you're new and you're reaching for a small brush, I urge you to fight that urge. It'll make everything look a little more lively, whimsical, and it keeps you out of your head for a little bit longer. So I'm starting in, I have a pretty high chroma palette. By that, I just mean there's not a lot of browns and not a lot of neutrals other than white. And I like to work this way because that's sort of how I learned originally. I find that the more colors I have, when I'm thinking less of how do I mix that color and then I'm thinking more about what color do I select. That's a really hard way of thinking about your painting. Your superpower as a painter will be the ability to look at a color and know exactly how to mix that. It's a hard skill. It can take time depending on, what your natural inclinations are and how long you've been playing with color. But the more you can develop that skill, the better your paintings are going to be by far. I would say more so than drawing or accuracy or even to some extent value. Learning how to mix and understand color is going to be a superpower. But that being said, I've mixed some Jenkins green, some oxide green with a little bit of red. Of course, that's going to pull down the intensity, which is exactly what I want to do. I also noticed that these backgrounds have a bluish tint to it, so I'm just going to add some blue. I don't give out color recipes, not because there's anything proprietary or I'm hiding anything, but because I really want the student to develop their own sense of color. You might start out with different colors. I, in the course, tell you what colors I'm mixing. I'm always going to tell you what's in my palette, but I want you to think of color as more of a way to orient yourself, more of like a compass than less of recipes. So by that, I just mean, instead of saying cadmium red, chromium oxide, a tablespoon of white, whatever, instead of giving you specifics, I'm just telling you warmer, cooler, more saturated, less saturated, darker, lighter. And sort of by using those different ways to orient yourself, you not only are going to develop a better sense of how to get there, but it's more universal. It really doesn't matter what's on your palette. And the way we all see color is so different. everyone's eyes are going to see and interpret things totally different. And I think a lot of building that up, building the ability to mix color up, should be very personal. And so I will help you orient, help guide you warmer, cooler. You'll learn the vocabulary, but at the end of the day, you're going to hone in on your own color sensibilities. And I think that's super important. And I'm just really passionate about that. I'm just going to start bopping in these colors. Another thing we're keeping an eye out for is things in the background are going to appear a little bit lighter, a little bit bluer, a little bit lower in saturation, so more muted, more neutral than things in the foreground. As painters, we are always wanting to try to force that perspective to give ourselves a sense of depth. So by not rendering and by painting the background muted and cool, we're already creating a dramatic sense of atmosphere, which is going to really help the things in the foreground pop. And again, I'm not being precious with this. I know I might have to paint over a lot of this, and I'm totally fine with that. The more layers you sort of add with acrylic, I think the more depth something has, the more interest it has, the less flat it looks. And so I'm not trying to make mistakes. I don't have to try to make mistakes, unfortunately. But if I don't get this right out of the gate, I'm just sort of close enough. That's fine by me. So I'm working my way up to what I would identify as the midground, probably in here, maybe some of this, and then this is the foreground. And so I'm just trying to make a conscious effort to really increase some of my saturation and really play around with my contrast. So how light or dark, how contrasting it is. Just adding a little bit of yellow. Yellow is not only going to brighten up what I'm painting, but it's going to make the green in my neutral color, my neutrally green, a lot more vibrant, which is exactly what I want. I'm applying it pretty thin. I'm really not being precious about it. I don't mind if the underpainting shows. You're going to see someone's humanity. What that means is you want to see your mistakes and where you exaggerate and where you downplay and the subtleties that come with making your own painting. I'm going to paint with fun and joy and excitement. And then if I want to refine on my next step, I can go in, I can be more discerning. In some places, instead of green, I'm really just painting with gray. But green can be really tricky. I have a whole course dedicated to the color green because it is notoriously a hard color. And one of the ways I combat this is by doing a lot of heavy lifting with neutrals, so with low intensity greens, but mostly these really nice gray colors. And then I pull in a little bit of the green and yellow. And within the context of what I'm painting, it looks really green without it looking artificial, like fake flowers. One thing that newer painters do is they will take breaks from looking at what they're painting. They sort of get sucked into the painting and forget their reference photo. So I'm always telling people one look, one brushstroke. So you're constantly checking in with your reference. When you're building up the form of the painting, you want to stay really attentive to what you're painting. I'm not going to make them as light as I want them to be in the finished product because I know that I can go back in and build up the value, build up the intensity. I am going to go back in with draw lines again, probably a different color. We make room for mistakes. Not only do we allow them, but we expect and we welcome them. Because I think if your approach to art and painting specifically is that one day you'll just get so good you won't make mistakes, I think you're in for a hard road ahead. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying people don't paint that way, but I found that by allowing yourself to make mistakes and learning how to work around them, it makes painting more enjoyable and it invites unexpected accidents into your practice. You know, something that's just an honest mistake ends up being your favorite part of the painting. And I think when you create space for that, it just makes it more fun and more personal. And that's how you find style. You don't flip through a catalog. You know, artists don't go to art school and get this huge catalog called the artist style catalog. You don't shop and pick your style. Your style arises from, of course, your interests and of course your skill, but also your mistakes, you know? And so I feel like if we wage war on natural mistakes, then we sort of take a lot of the fun out of painting. So I find myself kind of pivoting between greens and yellows and reds and oranges right now. And you might think orange is an odd color to add to green, but it's actually a great color to add to green because it's both going to warm up your green, and it's also, because of the red and orange, it's going to pull back the intensity. So if you have a green that's full of phthalo, really, really bright and artificial, and you want to use it because you're wanting to make something more saturated, but you don't want it to turn artificial, orange is a really good color to add because you're lightening it, you're adding yellow, and you're toning down that phthalo just ever so slightly. So anytime I do anything green, I will put oranges on my palette. I don't always have them on there, but it's a good color. It's also nice to start with orange as an underpainting because if you don't paint over it and it's not completely opaque, you can see some of that orange through, and it really helps to tone down, especially your first pass. And for my darker colors, I'm adding alizarin crimson, hooker's green, and a little bit of dioxazine violet. Because I don't have any black on my palette, and that's just a personal choice, you sort of have to know at any given point a pretty quick way to get to those darker values. I really never paint with black unless I'm doing something super graphic, really designy. Because of that, I have to know how to get to these darker colors, and alizarin crimson and phthalo green or hooker's green is a really good way to get there. And so I just figure out kind of what I need. And in this case, it's sort of a dark, cool green, and that combo gets me there pretty quickly. Okay, so I've done the bulk of my green. Obviously, it's not all covered. I got rid of a lot of the forms of the leaf. This first pass is really just about getting in your basic blocks of information. Of course, as I say that, then I identify things that I need to finish. And if you're asking why I'm kind of doing one color at a time, it's because I tend to be a little bit lazy and I don't like mixing and using a bunch of different brushes. So I will just use the same brush I can for as long as possible. This brush gets pretty muddy, it has all kinds of colors on it, and because of that, everything stays pretty muted. So that's good enough. Before I hop on these bright flowers, which I'm incredibly excited to get to, I'm gonna paint some more of the neutral aspects of my painting, specifically this corrugated plastic of the greenhouse. It's really pretty gray. The nice thing about gray is you can really push gray in any direction, right? If we think of a color wheel, we have all the colors on the perimeter. The highest saturated form of every color is on the outside. And then the middle is something called a true gray or an achromatic gray. It's not a color to be found. It's so centered that it's absent of color. It's black, gray, white, right? So if that makes sense. Most grays that are in paintings are going to be right around that central achromatic gray. It's going to be a chromatic gray. And so this is pretty dang close to true gray, but I am going to have it pull slightly violet because I want it to be cool and because I'm going to have to kind of pick a direction and a route to get to that gray. I'm going to mix colors that are going to cancel each other out. Again, I don't have gray on my palette and I don't have black, so I'm going to have to find a chromatic route to get to that gray. And I think I'm going to pick purple as kind of my avenue. And so what that looks like is I'm actually going to keep the green on here. I'm going to use that in my favor. So I'm going to start with a little bit of dioxazine violet. And then I have some of this green in here. I'm going to add white. And so now I have a little bit too chromatic of a gray. It's a little bit too violet-y. So I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to it. And the green is making it pull slightly green. So I'm gonna add some quinacridone magenta because it's a nice, cool red. And I don't want it to be warmer than it is. And that's how I get to this lovely achromatic gray. Once you learn how to get to gray, I feel like everything color-wise starts to make sense. People ask, how do I mix such bright, vivid colors? And truthfully, knowing how to get to brown and gray and neutrals gives you a perfect roadmap of what to avoid if you're wanting to keep your colors really high saturation. I'm going in a little darker because I'm going to go in and add some white to this basically and start to carve out that corrugation, but only slightly. Again, this is the first pass. I'm still just covering up cadmium orange, so I'm not overthinking it. And I know I'm in desperate need of a redraw because things feel pretty off, but we're just getting close enough. We're always kind of paying attention to what the light is doing. As a painter, especially if you're wanting to paint with relative realism, you sort of always have to be aware of what your light is doing. You know, even this part up here, that's a little bit closer to us. It's still, I need it to behave as a background character. So if I were to render this right now, it would jump way to the front, and I don't want that. Now I'm gonna finally approach these lovely violets and magentas in here. I'm gonna stick with my same old dirty brush. I know that seems counterintuitive because I finally got to the bright part and now I'm gonna use a muddy brush to paint it. But as much as I want them to pop, I know that I'm gonna sneak up on that color. So I'm not gonna make it incredibly vibrant right out of the gate. I'm taking a little bit of oxide green to pull it back, and then I'll work up. So the plants that are in the background particularly aren't going to be very bright. So this is a great starting point. And like I said, my goal for this first pass wasn't to create an amazing painting right away, of course. For me, it was really just giving myself the framework to now be able to go in and really refine. I probably don't need to redraw. I'm going to because it's part of my process and because I personally think it can be helpful. But if you don't like the look of like those random colors being in there, you could certainly go and just work your way through the composition. Because of blocking it in with a large brush, I've lost some of the form, specifically in the leaves. You can't really see them very well at this point. But if you went in and really blocked some of them in, you could start to find the form again. And I think it's a good picture of a framework so that now when I go forward, I can make better color choices because so much of that orange or that underpainting is covered up. And I personally like that some of the bright colors are shining through. As far as my style, I really like that. I don't love making things perfect, especially right away. And so having that show through is kind of a sign that I'm in the right direction. I like when my paintings look effortless and careless and yet beautifully rendered. And for me, that balance usually happens when I have some of this underpainting showing through. So now I'm going to jump in with another redraw. I'm not going to do the whole thing because I don't think the whole thing needs to be re-rendered, but just give myself a little bit of a form, and then I'm going to go in with another round of color. Basically, at this point, it's really rinse and repeat until you feel satisfied. Some people are going to do this 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. I certainly have, especially with large paintings. I'll kind of work segment by segment, and that's definitely how I work. Sometimes I'll nail it after a couple of goes, which is very fortunate. It's definitely not the goal every time, but it's personal choice, right? However resolved you want it to look, and of course, however easy the painting comes together. Some things just kind of show up on your lap and they resolve very quickly, and some paintings that even seem like they're going to be easy will sort of disintegrate. But if you have this approach where you can always go back in and redraw and rework things, then you could work on it forever, conceivably, until you're happy. So now I'm going to go in with a smaller brush. As you can see, I really worked with this 12 for this whole layer, the same exact brush. If you don't like the bright colors popping through, you could just choose like a hooker's green, maybe, just something really subdued. You just need it to have enough contrast that you can see your draw lines, you don't get confused. I like the draw lines. I like when stuff pops through that's not found in nature. I'm gonna choose a cadmium red because it's a nice warm red. It's not gonna clash with the flowers, I don't think. Obviously you don't know until you put it on your canvas. But it's gonna help my leaves make sense. And that's what I need help with the most. And I'm gonna work from the front to back because I feel like my brain is sharper now than it will be in 30 minutes. So I'm gonna try to use that to carve out the thing that needs to be more accurate. And then as I go backwards, it doesn't need to be as accurate. this looks like I've taken a step backwards. Again, it's not a rush towards completion. That's not the goal. You don't hang up a painting in a gallery with like stats on the side that say, finish this in 2 days, or, you know, fastest finished painting ever. Like it's not part of it. A finished painting is a standalone piece. So whether it takes you 6 months to finish something or, you know, 6 hours to finish something, it's just your own personal approach of how you get there. So no big deal. After I draw the lines, it might look more confusing, but for me, this is awesome and it helps me, because what I'm going to do now is go in with my darkest values. I work up the value scale generally. When I was a newer painter, I really stuck to this. You know, I think of it like kind of having guide rails, and it's a good strategy. Now I can sort of veer off just because I've done it a lot, but if I ever feel stuck, I kind of stick to that. I go back to darkest values first, work my way up, then top to bottom, and just back and forth, rinse and repeat. And so for this, because there's a lot going on, I'm gonna go ahead and carve out my darkest values and then continually reevaluate. So it's always helpful to figure out where in your composition your darkest values are. You don't want to go in with like a true black or something really close to a black, because it's going to punch a hole in your painting. If something needs to be dark, you can always darken it up later, but once you've sort of made something really dark, it's hard to come back from that. Because my first layer, the values were so condensed, I have a lot of room to play on either end of that value spectrum. So I believe my darkest values are kind of happening in here, which is great because it's the foreground, and everything in the foreground is going to be higher chroma, higher contrast. And part of something being higher contrast is that it has darker darks and lighter lights. And so keeping all of my darkest values right in here is going to create that elongation and that depth that I'm going for. By just darkening where I've just darkened, I've introduced a lot more depth back into the painting. After you work backwards with the redraw lines, you kind of make the painting look less like the ideal finished product. It's nice to make forward progress again. Okay, so I took a little break. I stress in the course the importance of taking breaks. As an artist, you know, we are not robots. So you need to step away from your painting. You need to have fresh eyes. A lot of painters will actually use mirrors and sort of look at their painting and their composition with fresh eyes. Mirrors can help with that. I think the best way to go about that is by taking frequent breaks, whether that's 5 minutes here or there, or when you get to a point in your painting you're really struggling, taking a full couple days off. It's super important. But regardless, I've come back with fresh eyes, and now I'm gonna jump right into it. So I have two approaches. One is I will work up and down the value scale like I've been doing. So I've got my darkest values in, and I might work up from that. The other approach is, I like to think of it like my putting out fires approach, which just means that I start with the most off part of the composition. For example, this leaf has been largely erased when I put in the background. I might go in and work for that. And then once I have the paint on my brush, I sort of hop around and figure out what the next most in need part of the composition is. It really depends on the day, and there's no right or wrong. In the course, especially the further into the painting you get, I really offer a lot of different approaches to resolving your painting. And it really becomes personal, because how resolved do you want it? It becomes a very subjective choice. Someone might look at this and be like, I'm only a couple strokes away from this being finished, and let it be really impressionistic and loose. And somebody else might be, I am 5 days away from being finished. So it's personal, it's subjective, but you can choose kind of your own path. But first I'm gonna clean my palette up. In the course, I go over different kinds of palette, like Stay Wet palette, freezer paper, and then I also use glass as a palette. I talk about brush maintenance and all kinds of technical stuff that if you took a painting course in college, that they would go over with you. So how to clean up your brushes, what kind of brushes you need. And then part of that is how to maintain your palette. I like to mist my palette with this little misting bottle. I go over a supply list in great detail in the course. And then I just scrape off this paint, and then I can mix right on top of it. You don't have to do this. You could just keep painting right on top of it. I like to have the clean, fresh start when I am in this part of the painting. So I'm gonna scrape all this acrylic paint off and start new. Another challenging component to painting green is you really have to stay pretty keyed into the undertone of the plant. I find that the foliage either pulls a true green or usually cool or warm. And just by that, I mean, does it have bluish undertones? Does it have yellowish undertones? And really playing into that is helpful, or else you end up with this like huge green blob and it's hard to tell forms apart from each other. And obviously part of that is fine if it kind of looks blobby, especially in the background. But when you're really trying to go for definition and you're aiming for things to be clear and easy to understand, I find that really isolating, identifying the undertones of your plants, your foliage, is very helpful. Again, I go into detail in this on my How to Paint Green course, but I also wanted to say that here and now because that's a lot of what I'm looking for. I didn't really concern myself with the undertone too much on my first pass because, again, I was just giving myself the information so that I can go back and make better decisions in the future. But now that I am refining a little bit, I'm taking more into account. I'm not just putting a good enough green down. I'm really identifying what exact color goes here. And I can always go back later. It doesn't have to be perfect right away, but it's a little closer than I was before because I have a little more information than I had before. You also begin to see the veins of the leaves and the striations and all the little subtleties that I left out up until this point. If you're a beginner painter, you maybe don't get to that at all, and that's totally fine. But depending on where you're at, you can sort of figure out as much detail as you want to incorporate. And then in this stage, this is where you would start to add that into your composition. Okay, I'm working my way through this painting. A lot of things are getting exciting. A lot of things are getting overwhelming. That's totally normal. I make a lot of paintings and I think sometimes people think that the whole time it's just smiling and sunshine. And I mean, I certainly have paintings that feel amazing from start to finish, but most of the time it's wrestling, right? It's a dance, it's a tango, it's a back and forth, and this painting is no exception. A lot of things are coming together in a really exciting way. I really like the light, how it's interacting with the leaves. I know I still need to push them a little bit, but again, we're building up to that contrast and that intensity. But things are starting to look like a painting, which is exciting. So I'm gonna take a quick break. I take a lot more breaks towards the end of the painting because I'm not moving through and just getting paint on the canvas. Now I'm really making those fine-tuned adjustments. So it's a little less just building up paint and a little more looking, going back and forth, checking, troubleshooting. One of the sections we have in the course is all about troubleshooting. I feel like that's a lot of what painting is, especially at the end, is where needs improvement. How do I improve that? It's a subtle skill, but it's a very important skill to have as an artist. That's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm going to take a quick break and come back with fresh eyes. working through a lot of this. A lot of thoughts are coming through my head. Really, it's a lot of what I already explained. It's revising, going over, redrawing, reassessing. You know, what I'm looking for is, because I'm not going for photorealism, I'm not going for that at all. I'm telling and asking myself, how resolved does this need to be in order to achieve your initial goal? My initial goal was I wanted to create a sense of luminosity. I wanted to create a composition that had a wonderful sense of complementary color. I really think I'm achieving that. And I'm getting to a point where I'm about ready to be done. This is an important part of the painting to talk through. You know, that middle phase is really just problem solving on repeat. But I always think of this like sticking the landing. If I mess anything up, I can always go back over it. There's one thing I really want you to know by this point is there's no mistakes. If you do something that doesn't make sense or that you wish you didn't do, you simply apply a color over it, or you simply just paint over that. And don't even think about it. It's not a big deal. This is how paintings come together. For me, I'm kind of hem-hawing over these 2 dewdrops, 3. I think they're pretty lovely. I like that it's in a group of 3. I'm gonna try to go for them and see if I can sort of hint at them without over rendering it, because nothing here is really super well rendered. This is all pretty brushy. But I'm gonna try and we'll see. You'll either see me paint them in and paint them out, or paint them in, hopefully the latter. So details, a lot like highlights, are so easy to overdo, but I see a darker color on the dewdrop. Of course, anytime I put a color in, I always see something else that needs to be fixed, but it's pretty normal. It's always hard to tell when something feels completely done, and you never really know. I, a lot of times, will feel like something's done. I'll even take a picture and then I'll look at it 2 hours later and then I'll see something that needs to be modified. So I say this all the time in the course, but given enough time, done might change. But in the moment, it feels pretty resolved. I kept it brushy, it's loose. There are flowers in the background that are super under resolved, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted some of them to look almost, if you cropped it, like it's abstract. And then the fact that the flowers in the front are rendered pulls the whole thing together. And that is exactly what I was going for. I also wanted to capture light. I think if given a little more time, I think I could capture light perhaps better, but again, it's hard to tell. So, you know, for me right now at this point, this feels found, it feels beautiful. I'm really excited about the color patterns happening. I preserved a lot of the redraw lines, but they're not overwhelming in my opinion. I'm really excited with how this turned out. I'm excited that you guys were able to follow along and watch it come together. Hopefully it was really fun for you to watch. And if there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's knowing that paintings aren't a straight shot. They aren't a race to a perfectly rendered image, that it's more of a winding path. And sometimes that can be a very scenic route. But it's really just an investigation, it's play, it's asking yourself questions, it's refining and expanding and moving forwards and backwards. It's not a straight line. And if you're able to gain that from it, even if you don't sign up for Not Sorry Art School, I hope that helps you. I hope you feel more confident in your artwork. But of course, I hope you stick around. I hope you take the course and delve into all that Not Sorry Art School has to offer. Not Sorry Art School is an online school that I created to be an answer to people asking me, how do I paint? How do I paint like you? I really wanted to create something that not only broke down what I'm doing, because I love sharing how I paint. I think it's really fun, but I wanted to create a curriculum where people could explore and find their own voice, their own style. And so it's a course with multiple different sections in it. The first course I ever created was the Foundations course. And in that, I teach you the fundamentals of how to construct a painting. I teach you the vocabulary that you'll need to understand and navigate painting as a medium. And I've only built on ever since. Every single quarter, we add another unit to Not Sorry Art School, which means it's always growing, it's always expanding, and I ultimately get feedback from you guys and add it into the course. So it's a very community-driven program. If you want to learn, if you are excited about painting, you want to understand the medium better, I highly encourage you to look into it, to sign up. I put a lot of love into it. There's a lot of technical stuff in there, and there's also a lot of really great perspective that I'm excited to share with you guys.